about y'all, but when I first started quilting, anytime I got to the end of a pattern and it said quilt as desired, and then make 2.5-inch strips of binding and so on as desired, that frustrated me so much because how the heck do I make binding and sew it onto a quilt? Today, I'm going to show you how to make traditional binding from start to finish. We're gonna make our binding, and I'm gonna show you the traditional way of making it for a quilt that has straight lines and points that line up. So like your traditional square rectangle quilt. And when you cut your binding strips out, you are gonna cut along the grain of the fabric. So this is a piece of fabric. You have your selvage right here, and I wanna make sure that those are lined up perfectly. And so when a pattern is asking you to cut, for example, most bindings on a pattern will say cut 2.5-inch strips by WOF. And WOF stands for width of fabric. And this is my width of fabric. And stereotypically, quilting cotton has 42 inches from selvage to selvage. So I'm going to make sure those are lined up perfectly at the bottom of the selvage. Then I'm going to line up one of the lines on my ruler, and I'm going to line it up with the top fold. And then I can create that straight edge. And for most fabrics, you want to cut 2.5-inch strips. If you are first learning to quilt, I would start with 2.5-inch strips of fabric. And then after your first quilt, play around with what you like most. 2.5-inch strips is the most traditional. I've learned that I kind of like 2.25-inch strips sometimes. And when I want a thick, chunky binding, I really love a 3-inch strip of binding. Then to cut my 2.5-inch strip, I can line up the 2.5-inch mark on the edge of my fabric and give it a nice cut. Perfect. Now you're gonna cut as many strips of fabric as you need for your quilt. And I don't know about you, but I hate doing quilt math, especially math for binding. That is just one thing I don't want to do. So I like to use a quilting calculator. And down below, I've created a downloadable, not just with all of the written instructions for how to put together all these methods of binding, but there is also a quilt calculator attached to it. So then all you have to do is enter the width and length of your quilt, and it will tell you how many strips of binding you're gonna need. Now let's put these binding strips together. For the quilt I'm binding, I needed 5 strips. It's a smaller quilt. And you are gonna open up your first strip of fabric, open up your next strip of fabric, then you are gonna line them up perpendicularly, and I like to use my selvage as a guide. So I'm gonna line them up just like that. And if you are doing this for the first time, pinning it is great. Then you are going to sew diagonally this way. You're not going to do it this way. You want to sew diagonally from the left to the right, because I want to show you, if you do sew the other way, look, my binding is just on top of each other, and that doesn't make a giant long strip. So we're going to take it to our machine and sew from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. The first strip is attached. Now we're going to attach the second strip in the same way. You're going to take the end of strip number 2, make sure it is right side up. Take your strip number 3 and overlap it perpendicularly. Then we're going to repeat that same process and sew diagonally from the upper left corner to the bottom right corner. And then add the next strip. And I just like to do this process on my machine rather than having to take it off every time. I just wanted to make sure that we had a nice close-up shot to show you. We're gonna add the last strip. Now we have one giant chain, and now we need to cut these little guys off. Before we cut this part off, I just want you to open this up, make sure it is a straight piece of fabric, nothing is wonky. You can either use scissors to cut off your extra or a rotary cutter, but you just want to make sure to cut 1/4 inch from that seam that you made. And we're just going to do that to all of our guys. Now we got a big long strip of fabric, and our last step to making our binding is to fold it in half. And we're just gonna fold it in half this way, and we're gonna press it all the way down. And my favorite little trick is to use a short ruler to roll up my binding as I'm pressing it. Just makes things a little bit easier. Then when you come up to a seam, you can either press it to the side or press it open. I like to press mine open, and that just reduces the bulk just a little bit. And continue pressing. Then you're gonna continue pressing your whole strip in half. And then you repeat that until your whole strip is pressed. We got our binding and our quilt top, and now I'm gonna show you how to sew it on. And whether you're machine binding or hand binding your quilt, you're gonna start with this same way to sew on the first half of your binding. To start your binding, you want about an 8-inch-ish tail of binding just left up top. I don't measure it, I just look at it with my eye and say, I think that's enough. And where the end of that mark is, that is where I'm gonna start sewing. I'm gonna line the edge of my binding up with the edge of my quilt, and do you see how this is hanging right there? This is gonna hang, and I'm gonna start sewing right where my finger is. And you're gonna sew using a 1/4-inch seam allowance. And when sewing on binding, I know that sometimes you can get a little smaller than a 1/4-inch or a little bigger than a 1/4-inch seam allowance. If you're gonna do anything, I'd rather it be a little bit bigger than smaller. But do your best to keep a 1/4-inch seam allowance. Now to get your perfect corners. I would normally do this at my machine, but I want to show you a close up. So right here is my corner, and right here is where the binding overlaps that corner where it ends. When you get to your corner, you want to measure around 1/4 inch in diagonally from where that corner ends. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew all the way up to that point, and then I'm going to sew diagonally off my quilt. Get to that 1/4-inch mark, sew diagonally off. Then I'm gonna fold back my binding to create that 45-degree angle, and I'm gonna fold the rest of the binding on top of that. And I wanna make sure everything is lined up square, so that just means that the fold right here and the fold right here line up with the edge, and this part of the binding that we folded over is lining up with the binding that is on top of it. Once everything's lined up, you're gonna take it to your machine and just start from the edge and sew 1/4 inch down to the next corner, and then you're gonna repeat this whole process for all 4 corners. The end of my binding is almost to where I started, so I'm gonna stop around 10 inches away from this point where I started. And here's how we're gonna connect these 2 points. I'm gonna first lay my first strip down, and I'm gonna take some scissors and I'm gonna cut it somewhere in the middle-ish. Then I'm gonna line up this next strip on top of that. Now you're gonna take this little piece that we cut off and use it as a measuring tool. So I'm going to open it up right here, and I'm gonna lay my next strip on top of that piece. And wherever the end of that strip is, I'm gonna cut around 1/8 inch before the end of that strip. And this measurement is just whatever the width of your binding is. So if I'm doing a 3-inch binding, then it would be a 3-inch measurement. But this is 2.5 inches, so there's only 2.5 inches of overlap. Then I'm gonna take this top piece and I'm gonna open it up. And I'm gonna take this bottom piece, I'm gonna open it up. And I wanna make sure my bottom piece has my right side up, and my top piece is going to be right side down. And I'm going to line them up perpendicularly like this. Sometimes the bulk of the quilt makes it a little bit hard, so I like to use a clip just to clip those together. Then I'm gonna line these up, and I just wanna make sure that the edges line up. And you can throw a couple pins in it if you would like. And then I'm gonna sew a diagonal line from this corner to this corner right here. And before I sew it, sometimes I like to pin that diagonal line, because in the past I have been known to twist up my binding, and I wanna make sure that whenever my binding is done and it is closed, it is not gonna be twisted in any way possible. So now that I know it's not gonna be twisted, I'm gonna pin it in a little bit easier way. Then I'm gonna sew corner to corner. Everything is sewn together. Now before you cut off that extra piece, pull it tight to make sure everything lays flat and nothing is twisted. Then we can take this little extra piece and cut it off around 1/4 inch from the edge of your seam line. And I like to finger press it down, fold it back over, and then we can sew the rest of this shut with our machine. And now you got your binding on your quilt. Wasn't that easier than you thought? And if you are brand new to this, I promise it gets easier the more you do it. It will become second nature. So the first time you do it, it may be a little bit tricky, and every time after, it'll get easier and easier. You've got this. So we gotta flip our binding over, and I'm gonna show you a couple ways that you can baste it. First, I like to press the edge of my binding out, and I do this by running the edge of my iron along the edge of the binding strip right here. And that just ensures that there's no extra fabric being folded over. And then when I get to the corners, I just like to take the point of my iron and press it out this way. Typically with binding, I like to sew my binding onto the top of my quilt and then fold it over to the back. But depending on how you want to finish off your quilt, you can start it on the back and fold it over to the front. Either way works. Now that it's all pressed out, I'm going to turn it over. One of the ways you can baste your binding is just by folding your binding over, and I like to do it so that it overlaps your seam line by 1/8 of an inch, and clip it and do that all the way around. Or you can glue baste it, and I like to use just regular white school glue. Some people like to use glue sticks. I find that the liquid glue works a little better. And the best part about this is it washes out. I'll put little dots of glue along the edge, and I want to make sure to get it as close to the edge as possible so that it's not on that stitch line. And then I can overlap my stitch line again by 1/8 of an inch. And when I run my iron on top of it, the heat from the iron dries the glue and nothing moves. It's perfect. Then when you're doing your corner, you want to first make sure that you poke your corner out right here so it looks nice and straight on this side. Then on this side, I'm going to fold this part down. Then on this side, I'm going to fold this part down. Then I'm going to place a pin at the end of that point and fold the rest of the fabric on top of that. And you got a perfect point right there, except if you notice that this edge part doesn't line up perfectly with the next piece, I can put my pin inside this part and kind of manipulate it where I want it. Then once everything is lined up the way I want, I can either clip it or I can glue baste it. And to glue baste it, I'm going to just do that same thing. I'm going to put a little bit of glue down here, press everything down. I'll add a little bit of glue right here, use my pin, fold it over. Again, I'm going to manipulate that part of the fabric to be where I want it, and then I can press it and the glue will dry it exactly where I want. Then, to make sure these corners stay perfect, I'd like to just put a clip on it, and that just holds it down until I'm ready to sew it down. Hopefully this gives you a little bit more confidence into binding your quilts. If you want to learn 3 different ways to finish off your binding, we have a video on that, so check that out. Make sure to like and subscribe for more quilting content, and I'll see you next time.